Hi. So we begin today to explore the reign of King Saul. And as I tried to show in the last video in the introduction to 1 Samuel 11 to 15, there are many complex lines of the cross here of motivation and causation and outcome. So I hope if you haven't watched it yet, you go back and watch the introductory video if you're not familiar with these chapters to get a sense of the overall picture of what we're going to see as we go through it scene at a time. On the right side of the screen today, you can see what we went over last time, the black and yellow chart that shows each of the passages here. So today we're not even going to cover the whole passage of 11:1 to 11. We're just going to cover the first part, the first 7 verses here, where Nahash the Ammonite threatens the people of Jabesh-Gilead. And one of the themes we're going to look at today is how Saul, although declared king, and also declared Nagid, translated as prince, but as I said last time, that's a little misleading since he's obviously not the son of a king, the usual association with the English word prince, some other kind of leader that's not exactly clear what it is. In this first chapter, it's more like he's a judge, and we'll see how that explicitly echoes some scenes from the book of Judges that are not necessarily complementary to Saul, but lead the audience to have to meditate on what is the difference in having Saul as king versus what happened before. And that has to do not just with kingship in general, but with Saul in particular, from Gibeah and Benjamin and some of the other aspects of what we're going to see here. So let's return briefly to our issues about Saul that we looked at all the way at the very beginning of the Saul section here. Here we are on this section here, if number 5 and 6. If Saul is meant to be a king, why is he described receiving the Spirit of God like a judge, as we'll see in our passage today? And similarly, in the next verse, why would Saul choose to remind the people of the Gibeah rape incident by sending pieces of an oxen throughout Israel to muster troops? I'm not suggesting we're going to have an answer to either of those questions, but those are certainly things that we need to be considering as we go through here. And I'm going to bring up this echoes of Judges in 1 Samuel so we can see some of the aspects in advance of what we're going to be looking at as we go. So first of all, the Ammonites. The fact that the narrator here is choosing the Ammonites as the first test of Saul's reign is echoing something very specific from Judges, as we'll look at in just a minute when we get there. Similarly, the fact that the Ammonites are attacking Jabesh-Gilead also has an echo, one that specifically links those people with Saul's ancestors in Benjamin. It's not clear exactly how far back in time, but the people of Jabesh-Gilead and Benjamin, as we'll see, have been merged by marriage and are in essence one people. We'll see how the Spirit of God rushing upon Saul echoes a number of passages you can see there from Judges, a typical way that someone becomes a judge. Again, judge not like we might think of in the Western world here, with sitting on a bench executing or interpreting laws, but as someone who has the Spirit of God, or whether that's Elohim or Yahweh, to save the Israelites from enemies. And then we'll look at some more of the rest of these as we go. That's probably enough for now. But just to highlight that the authors are clearly making the question of the echoes of Judges a theme here. And as we saw last time with the quote from Ian Wilson's book about history and memory, that's a lot of what's going on here, just as we see in any whatever cultural context you want to talk about, wherever you're watching and listening to this video, of how current-day politicians and leaders try to either echo positively people that they admire, or they think the people admire from the past, or negatively of people they're trying to distinguish themselves from. Whether that's the generic thing of comparing negatively people to Hitler, or more positively to presidents or leaders that they like. In the UK, that might be Churchill. In the US, depending on your perspective, that could be Kennedy or Johnson or Reagan or Lincoln from the deeper past. So we're seeing similarly here that the authors of 1 Samuel are not only talking about their situation, whenever their situation was, and as we've seen, there are potential sources of this text from contemporaneous sources from the time of Saul and David in the 10th century BCE, all the way up to the exile and beyond. And I'm not going to try to parse those out, and scholars who do often get stuck on the mystery of this text, which leaves no easy answers on those questions. So let's just jump right into our text. We left off in the previous video before the summary. So it ended with after Saul is made king, and he has with him, as you can see there in verse 26 in chapter 10, warriors whose hearts God had touched, but some sons of Belial, as we saw, raised the question, how can this man save us? And as we saw last time, the word for save is the word for Yeshua, or Jesus, Joshua in the New Testament. So they raised that question, but Saul holds his peace. This long rest of verse 27 is curiously neither in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew from which modern translations are taken, or in the Septuagint, the Greek text. text. Rather, it's only found in one form of 1 Samuel from the desert community at Qumran. And I'm not going to go through that now because much of what we find there is also expressed in chapter 11. And although it's in the New Revised Standard here, it wasn't in the original text of the Masoretic community. So we're just going to follow it here from chapter 11. So about a month later, and already here, this is from the Septuagint, the Hebrew just starts with Nahash the Ammonite went up. So the word for besieged here, achan, literally just means to encamp. So besieged is overstating it a little bit, and we'll see the Philistines later, as you can see in my note in chapter 13. Encamping, which is preparing for an attack, but not necessarily engaging in one. Nahash the Ammonite went up and encamped at Jabesh-Gilead. And a couple things we need to stop at here. Just by himself? Is it just the king? And we're not even told he's the king here. We're just told he's not Nahash the Ammonite. And we assume, as I just assumed, that he was the king, but it doesn't say that. And in a chapter and in a section that's all about what authority people have to lead their people in battle or to defend them against enemies in battle, that's an interesting point here, that we don't know who this person is. And as far as we can tell, he's there alone, which obviously doesn't make any sense. One man would not be a threat. Goliath even wasn't alone. He had Philistines all around him. So we have to assume that it implies some kind of army, but curiously, it's not named there. In contrast, what we'll see, that we won't see it in today's video, but we'll see after it, that when Saul does muster the people, we see a large number who are described as responding. And we'll see a number of things about numbers of troops throughout these chapters. So the authors make the question of numbers an important one in terms of the chance of victory, and that also is echoing Judges, although it's not a specific image or verse, so I didn't put that in the chart here. But we have to assume what the text doesn't tell us, that Nahash has an Ammonite army there. And why he picks Jabesh-Gilead, we don't know, but let's look at the atlas to get some sense of these places. So here's Gibeah of Saul, as we'll see it described, and the various places where Samuel's been in Mizpah and Ramah, and we've seen those already. And here's Jabesh-Gilead up here, and then off to the east here is Ammon, where the Ammonites are, of course, on the other side of the Jordan River here, which is flowing through here. So it's not a long distance, but it's outside of their immediate area. And I want to make sense of that, because when we zoom out on the map and you look at the bigger picture, what we might think of as Israel is this entire area here. Although you'll note it's not called that here because there's no formal boundary at this point, other than what we saw in the book of Joshua. And in fact, Israel will be described as, in terms of boundaries, we'll see in verse 3 in just a minute. So why he goes after Jabesh-Gilead, I don't know, but no other reason. It certainly echoes what we've seen in the echoes of Judges. So let's look at that a little bit to see what these specific echoes are. I won't go back and look at these texts from Judges. I would encourage you to do that, and you can obviously download this PDF from the webpage and do that yourself. But I just want to summarize that so we can get a sense of what the echo is. So you see there from chapter 10 in Judges, Yahweh sends the Ammonites, so they're tools of Yahweh there, to oppress the Israelites in Gilead, because the Israelites were worshiping the gods of the peoples of the land, including of the Ammonites, but also of the Philistines and others there. So the Ammonites are God's sword to oppress the Israelites there. Later, though, in Judges, a chapter later, the Ammonites on their own make war on Israel, and the elders of Gilead bring Jephthah to fight for them. And that's not just some random thing, because Jephthah is going to come up here again, as we'll see in verse 6, with the Spirit of God rushing on him, specifically to battle the Ammonites. But Jephthah also comes up, as we'll see in chapter 14, because as preparation for his battle, he made a foolish vow that the first person, if they won the battle, the first person to come out of his house he would kill, and it becomes his daughter, which echoes in many ways what New Revised Standard describes as a rash oath that Saul makes to keep the people from eating, in order to keep them devoted to Yahweh while they prepare for battle. And his son Jonathan tastes the honey, contrary to Saul's knowledge. But when Saul finds out it's Jonathan, he orders Jonathan killed. So Jephthah, as someone who was willing to make a vow that cost him his daughter's life, is certainly in the background as we hear this echo of Jabesh-Gilead and the Ammonites from the book of Judges. So that sets up our scene here. So having Nahash having gone up and encamped there, all the men of Jabesh. And it's curiously here described as all the men, not all the people. Sometimes in the RSV, what we see as the Israelites is the Ish of Israel, the men. But here it's specific. For no reason that's named here. Other times we've seen the people or the elders of the people, but here it's suggesting all the men of the city, not specifically the elders. So they said to Nahash, make a treaty, but more literally, cut a covenant. The first use of the Hebrew berith in 1 Samuel, since Ark of the Covenant, where we didn't actually see a covenant, we just saw the Ark. So here we're seeing a covenant as not something between God and people, like between God and Abraham in Genesis 17, or between God and the Israelites in the Exodus story, but here between two people. And as you can see from my note in the lower left, we'll see several examples of interpersonal covenants there between Jonathan and David in chapter 18, and 2 Samuel between Saul's, at that point, former general Abner and David, and then just a little later between David and the elders of Israel. So these are interpersonal covenants. Treaty is a fair translation of that, but I want to highlight that it's the word for covenant because covenant carries such special meaning throughout the Bible. The people of Jabesh said to Nahash, make a covenant with us and we will serve you. So they're willing to go along with the threat here. We're not clear what the terms of the covenant would be, and of course that would make all the difference. But here's the condition that Nahash proposes. On this condition I will make a covenant with you, namely that I gouge out everyone's right eye and thus put disgrace upon Israel. As Bodner notes in my note before, the Hebrew is a little less clear. We could hear it as when every right eye is gouged out of you. Not so much that he's doing that, Nahash is doing it personally. And thus put disgrace, here, herpa, we'll see several times, a sense of national dishonor, upon all Israel. But as my note below suggests, why would a disgrace be upon all Israel if it's only Jabesh-Gilead that is being attacked, this one town in isolation from the rest of the nation? We don't really know what the state of national unity is amongst the people of Israel, and we've hardly seen them as tribal people. Here they're not named as tribal people. They're named as the people of a city. And yet, certainly Saul is of Benjamin, and we'll see those echoes again from Judges in just another couple of verses. So whether Nahash understands this as attack on one as an attack on all, perhaps as the 9/11 attack on the towers in New York City was obviously an attack on all America. Perhaps he sees it as symbolic that way. But we'll see what happens in the following verses, whether everybody sees it that way. And then in verse 3, not all the men of Jabesh, but now the elders of Jabesh, matching the elders of Israel who asked for a king in chapter 8, and we'll see other elders later, as you can see in my note below. So why it shifts from all the men to the elders, it's not clear, but they propose, rather than the covenant, they propose a 7-day respite to consider whether they can find someone to fight Nahash off. Why he would accept that isn't clear, but let's look at the language of that briefly here. So give us here, the word heref in the hifel stem means, as this translation suggests, to give time, but in other stems it can have the connotation to become slack, to resist, to lose heart, or other expressions of lost hope. So implied in the immediate meaning of give us time is also the sense of being in a struggle and whether one has hope for victory in that struggle or not. So give us 7 days that we may send messengers here, Malachim. And we've only seen messengers one other time, but as my note shows below, it's a key word here, and we've been looking at how key words used a number of times in a given passage is often the biblical writer's way of focusing attention. And we're going to see messengers in a number of other places, especially in the David story, when in royal situations, people don't speak directly, but have other people send their messages for them. But this is not a royal court. This is something very different, and in many ways, it's kind of nonsensical and paradoxical, but let's look at what it says before we draw any conclusions. So the elders of Jabesh said to Nahash, give us 7 days respite that we may send messengers through all the territory of Israel. And here's where the word here, Gavul, literally means boundary. So not the land, Eretz Israel, but throughout the boundary of Israel. And you can see that word is used a number of times. But it's highlighting that it's not a tribal issue here. It's throughout the entire boundary, not mustering tribes in particular. Then, if there's no one to save us here, or literally to deliver us, and we'll see echoes of that as well, we will give ourselves up to you. I note that the New Revised Standard does not have a close quote there, even though the quote is closed. And we don't hear any response from the Ammonites or from Nahash in particular, but it seems to have been accepted because obviously he doesn't go to battle at that moment. But one thing to note, as many scholars do as we go here, why are the elders of Jabesh not calling immediately upon Saul? He's just been made king, and they certainly must know that because as the text from the text from Judges highlight there in that note that Jabesh-Gileadites were intermarried with the people of Benjamin after the Israelites destroyed all the other people of Jabesh-Gilead in a harem, a holy war, exactly what Saul will be called upon to conduct against the Amalekites in chapter 15. But rather than cut off Benjamin completely from Israel, having destroyed their women, they take 400 virgin women from Jabesh-Gilead and intermarry them with the Benjaminites. So Saul may well be a descendant of one of those intermarriages, but certainly the Jabesh-Gileadites and the wider circle of Benjaminites are well known to each other in our family. So there's no reason to think that they wouldn't know Saul. And yet they don't go for Saul. They send the messengers throughout all of Israel to see if there's anyone there who can save them. And the messengers come to Gibeah of Saul, which, as I've noted in different contexts, is an unusual way to talk about that. It's not Saul of Gibeah, like we might think of other people, a person of a place. Joseph of Arimathea, for example, in the New Testament, or Mary of Magdala. But here, the city of the person, highlighting that Saul is associated with Gibeah, and Gibeah with Saul, and also with his father, as we saw when Saul was first called. So the issue of Gibeah also brings up the question of Judges, but I didn't mention that here in particular. We've looked at that before. So when they come to Gibeah of Saul, they reported the matter in the hearing of all the people, and they still don't go to Saul. So even when the messengers come to his specific city, they're not thinking that Saul is the one. Saul will only hear about it indirectly, as we'll see in just the next couple of verses. And when they report the matter, all the people wept aloud. And I'll scroll down a little bit to get the rest of our passage for today and highlight the weeping. And that leads us to look briefly at the role of weeping, and also at the same time here the role of anger. Because many people, certainly in a Christian context, might not associate these kinds of emotions with religion because of the Platonic influence that represses passions and emotions. But the Israelite people were not Platonists, and emotions are clearly a part of the story here as expressions of one thing or another. Here of weeping and sadness, and then, as we'll see in a couple of verses, of anger. So the only weeping we seen earlier was Hannah for not having children, but we'll see a number of people weep, and especially David. If we associate weeping as feminine and not a masculine thing, well, plainly this text isn't worried about that at all. Nobody's challenging David's quote-unquote masculinity, and I put it in quotes here just to highlight the cultural definition that's at issue, theirs or ours. But he certainly weeps a number of times, twice for dead children, but also over friends and others, over the death of Jonathan, but also over his extended family and supporters in Ziklag, as we'll see there. And similarly with anger, we'll see Saul angry in just a minute. We'll see Saul a couple of times angry. Anger can be a vehicle to express a response to injustice, but can also be, as we'll see, jealousy or envy. So whether that's God's anger, a jealous God who can get angry, or these other characters, we'll see more of that as we go. So returning here to the question of the echoes up there. So now, having had that all happen, we hear that, as Helverson and Holmes highlight here in my note below, meant to humiliate all Israel, the Ammonite king's proposal roused Saul from his retreat into private life. That's their version of it. Was he retreating into private life, though, or had he just not gotten started yet? There's not a sense of he's retreating if he hasn't quite gotten started. But the narrator, or the writer here, changes our tone quickly with Gehenna, and behold. So after all the messengers are going on around the land and the people are weeping, and behold, Saul was coming from the field behind the oxen. And whether that's a retreat or him just going about his business apparently as a farmer, and Saul said, not to anybody in particular as far as we can tell, whether that's to the messengers. The messengers didn't come to Saul, as we saw. They expressed it in the hearing of the people. Saul was just coming in from the field, and he hadn't apparently heard it because they have to repeat it to him. So it doesn't seem like he's saying it to them, but his response is, what is the matter with the people? Or literally from the Hebrew, what is with the people that they are weeping? So they told him the message from the inhabitants of Jabesh. Whether they told them accurately or not is a question the narrator and the writer here leave open. People like Meyer Sternberg help us to see, and we'll see this greatly in the story about Uriah and Bathsheba and David in 2 Samuel, that how messages are repeated or not repeated is a major element in how we determine intention and other factors. But here the writer's not doing that. We just assume it's told accurately. And so upon hearing it, Saul doesn't do anything. God does something. The Spirit of God came upon Saul. And I've got some other examples here down below of the Spirit of God enkindling anger, but I want to focus more specifically on the Spirit of God rushing, because that's what the word here, the translators here take the word for that's rushed in Hebrew and break it up here and came upon in power. There's no specific word for in power here. Here the word is tzlach. It's hard to pronounce without the vowels, but it rushed upon various judges. So that was the question that we saw here in this issues thing of why is he described receiving the Spirit of God like a judge if he's supposed to be a king? Because nothing here looks royal. Everything here looks like a previous judge, like Othniel and Gideon and Jephthah specifically, and also Samson 4 times with Samson, as we'll see. So it comes upon Saul, and when he heard these words, his anger was greatly kindled. Again, there's the anger we've seen before. And his response is this. He took a yoke of oxen and cut them in pieces and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by messengers. And my note from Robert Alter below really brings this the theme here to a point. So we hear him say, from my line here, the illusion of the dismemberment of the concubine in Judges 19 is, quoting Alter here, exquisitely ambiguous. Is this an act of restitution, a settling right of the ghastly civil war caused by the atrocity at Gibeah, or does it inaugurate the narrative of Saul's public actions under the shadow of an earlier act of turpitude? In other words, since there's no explicit mention of the rape of the concubine and her body being cut up and sent all around, only readers who are alert to that would be aware of it. So it's not that we can infer that Saul is specifically trying to undo that, but it certainly is an echo of something that would bring a negative association with the people of Benjamin. And you can see that on the right side, the blue section there from 11:7 and 8. And if you're not familiar with that story, I really encourage you to read it. It's a terrifying story, but it's because it's such a terrifying story, it's certainly one that would be in the ears of the audience associated with Benjamin, where a man's concubine is raped outside the door of the person who he's been given hospitality by, and seemingly with no concern about her dead body or how she's been treated, he cuts her body up and sends it all around. And the people from all around Israel, as you see, they're assembled in one body before Yahweh at Mizpah, and as we see here, similarly the people come out as one. A very explicit echo. So when we see here that her body, and I'll go down to the bottom of the verse here where I'm going to stop, the body of her body is sent throughout the territory by messengers, we recognize there are now 2 sets of messengers. There's the messengers that were sent by the elders of Jabesh-Gilead with a search for a champion, and now there's the messengers sent by Saul with these pieces of the oxen with this dire message, very threatening message. Whoever does not come out after Saul and Samuel, so shall it be done to his oxen. 2 points to make there. Saul and Samuel? Why does he bring Samuel back into this? If he's king, what is Samuel's role? Is it that, as many scholars have suggested, Saul's insecure and feels like he needs to rely on Samuel's authority? Perhaps, but if he has the Spirit of God upon him, that would seem to be enough to give him the confidence he needs. And yet, the threat is a terrible threat. We'll see it echoed indirectly by Samuel's not threat but action in chapter 12, where to prove that he has divine authority, he calls on Yahweh to bring a thunderstorm on the wheat harvest, destroying their source of sustenance. And here the threat is, if you don't come out after us, we'll destroy all your oxen that you obviously need for farming. And that leads to the dread of Yahweh to fall upon the people. Not the dread of Saul or the dread of Saul and Samuel, but the dread of Yahweh. So whether we take that as as Lee does in my note below, trying to read Saul positively, she says that Saul's message brings fear of Yahweh rather than fear of Saul or fear of consequences, suggests that Saul's first real act of kingship is taking things in the right direction, and the people respond by following his lead. That's one way to look at it, but other scholars look at it other ways. I left that quote in there so you can just see the various ways that people interpret this depending upon their own perspective. But the outcome is they come out at one, that fear of Yahweh, dread of Yahweh, not dread of Saul and Samuel is what lead them. And so Saul has successfully rallied the troops, acting exactly like a judge and not like a king. And we'll see what happens when we continue and the battle takes place next time. See you then. Bye-bye.